If you're curious to hear a little music from our guest Carla Lucero, who we spoke to in our most recent episode, check out E4TT's annual concert of music by women and non-binary composers, Midnight Serenades, on January 25th. Welcome to For Good Measure, an interview series celebrating diverse composers and other creative artists, sponsored by a grant from the California Arts Council. I'm Nanette McGuinness, Artistic Executive Director of Ensemble for these times. In this week's episode, we continue our conversation with Nina Shekhar, who we spoke to in December 2023. Do you find that as you explore the vulnerability and expand that the boundary keeps changing and that you become more comfortable? Or do you have a pretty hard stop where it just kind of goes, okay, no more?
I think it changes. For me, when I think about vulnerability, I think of kind of like ownership of identity and how we share that with others. And for me, after I wrote the piece I'm talking about is called Corkhead. After I wrote that piece, um, I did kind of have a period afterwards where I fell into like a quite major depression like afterwards. And I think some of that was because, after you share all this stuff about yourself that's very personal and that I hadn't shared before, I was kind of in this void afterwards, like, now what? And it was like, there's not a lot of support, for artists, like after they do something like that to, help with like cope with that, and it was a really challenging time. And then I ended up, going to therapy and having some sort of support. But I think since then I've been quite protective over the way I approach vulnerability in my music, and realizing like I can share things but on my own terms, and
Absolutely.
and sometimes, I've been exploring that idea of identity in different ways, like sometimes I examine like a piece of mine I can think of, called Above the Fray. It's like about sort of my relationship to classical music in general. Like that piece kind of takes the Bach cello prelude in G and warps it in different ways. And it's like also very much related to my identity, but in a very different way than like other pieces I've written. And a lot of pieces of mine sometimes do things with double meanings now. And so it's kind of interesting. Or sometimes I'll throw in references. Another piece I wrote recently has a lot of references to Bollywood, and it's kind of about like sexuality and
Yeah.
in Indian cinema and things like that. And I know that most people won't recognize some of those references, but there will be, like, my mom once was in the audience for one of these pieces and she knew all the references right away. So like I think that's also become part of the way I approach vulnerability. Is like, sometimes I'm sharing things of myself, but I know that not everybody will understand it or know what is it I'm referring to. But then there will always be specific people I'm trying to reach that will understand right away. And I think it's just changed the way I approach, like, even just sharing these elements of myself with others.
That makes sense. I mean, the whole point of in jokes are there are some people who won't get them and some of people who
Right.
will,
Mm-hmm.
but that the piece still works, the various Haydn and Mozart and Beethoven pieces that have jokes in them, they still work, even if you don't.
Right. And I think in this context, I've been thinking about, like, yeah, this idea of inside jokes and like who gets to be in on the joke. And I think for so long, my parents never went to classical concerts. I mean, I didn't go to an orchestra concert, like a professional orchestra concert, until my undergrad.
Oh,
And
wow.
I didn't really have that experience. And so my parents didn't grow up with like understanding you're not supposed to clap between movements. They were never like in on the joke. But that's why I feel sometimes when I do these pieces that have these references that only they can understand, it's like suddenly I flip the joke. It's like now they're the only ones nobody
Yes,
else is, and like they're
yes.
now suddenly in the powerful position. So I think that that's something that it's interesting, just like flipping that power dynamic in
Hmm.
this kind of subversive way has been really fun in a sense of like how I approach identity, in my work.
Yeah, no, that I like that. What was the name of the piece you were focusing on OCD? What was the
Oh yeah, it was called Quirkhead.
Quarkhead? Okay.
Yeah, like Quirk head. So,
Okay. That's what it
yeah.
sounded like.
Yeah, no, Quirkhead was just a nickname for myself. So I didn't know that OCD was like there was a term for that growing up. And so I just would always say, well, I'm very quirky. And then I just made up this name Quirkhead to describe myself. And then actually over time, because there was, I don't know, I think culturally, a lot of Asian cultures are very afraid about talking about mental illness and about OCD. And so I had a lot of shame around it, and I was like afraid to even use the word OCD. So then I would use this word Quirkhead as like a euphemism for that. So that's what the title refers to. This is
That's
like
really
this,
great. Yeah,
in a
yeah.
sense, a term of endearment for myself because it sounded less scary than like OCD, like disorder in the word. For me, it's like Quirkhead. It's like, oh,
Oh, okay. Yeah, yeah,
lighthearted. Yeah.
yeah. You mentioned above the fray that you looked at vulnerability and maybe identity too in a different way from your other works. How so, if you could articulate that?
Yeah. So that piece, I was kind of warping some melodic structures and the very famous Bach cello prelude in G, which I picked because it's probably one of the only classical pieces that my parents would recognize. It's like the quintessential piece of classical music. And
Right, right.
that was a piece that I wrote during the pandemic also. And so I was thinking about this idea of time and individual senses of time. And around this era, a lot of orchestras were doing these click track pieces where, they everybody was in their apartment and then they give them a click track. Okay, you play your flute two part of this Beethoven symphony, like, and then we'll put them all together. And then I just thought it was not really using that, like they're just forcing the same model into this different situation rather than actually thinking creatively about, well, what if we're all feeling time differently? So it kind of stemmed from that. And also, around this time, a lot of organizations were putting out these like Bach recording as if like, oh, Bach is the savior. And I just thought it was ridiculous. I mean, there were so many things going on. There was the pandemic, there was all the protests after George Floyd, all this stuff was going on. And it's like you totally miss the moment and like you're putting out a Bach recording. And so I was thinking like, well, what if there's some way we could explore, but everybody has a different relationship to this music. It's like not everybody's going to think of him as a savior. Not everybody's going to know his music. Like we all have very different relationships. So what happens if that music, rather than forcing it to be kind of preserved in this glass box, like we allow it to degrade over time, or we allow it to detune over time, or like move through it at a different rate, or have it take on a new life over time. And so I warped it into like 12 different layers, and it was like a multi-track piece, and everybody recorded their part in their own apartment. They had like there was no bar line, so that it's all spatially notated, so they kind of moved through their own sense of time. And
Mm.
in a way with this piece, even though I like it forced me to examine my own relationship with Bach and when I feel like an insider, when I feel like an outsider, um, and just kind of that whole dynamic. And but it's like what I love about that piece is that you can't really tell if I'm critiquing Bach or if I'm glorifying Bach, which is like the whole point. And I think that that's very much reflective of my own identity. Like I grew up playing Bach sonatas like on the flute, but I also, I never went to orchestra. Like I didn't really go to performances of, I didn't choose to listen to it when I was growing up. So I had this kind of in and out relationship with that music, and I think it's kind of very much reflective of my practice even now, where I'm like, what is classical music? Am I in it or am I out? Like, what does that mean? And I think in a different way, it's a little bit more abstract, that piece, than, I mean, there's no words in that piece, so that also changes things than like other pieces I've written that were very much rooted in like a narrative, a very personal narrative. But this piece is personal in a different way, and
Clearly.
in a more conceptual way, I think, than in like a more text-based way.
Yeah. No, I think that notion of what is classical music today is something that we as musicians and composers as well are really kind of unpacking and examining and kind of deciding. It is kind of the question du jour in a way.
Right, exactly. I think that's an important question that we ask. And I think it's really important, just for the sustainability of our field, like to think like, why are we making the music we're making, and why are we choosing to engage with it in this way? And is there a chance we can engage with it differently? Or, every artist Bach is such an interesting example, because the Baroque era, like so much stuff was improvised, and knowing him, he was also just trying to pay his bills. Like he was just like, he was the most like perfunctory composer. He was not looking to do this grand emotional expression the way that maybe some other composers were. He was just like trying to fulfill his job. And also like the practice of the time was for performers to put themselves in the work and improvise, add ornaments. Like it was meant more as like something to be changed rather than something to be austere. And so it's really interesting that now there's this notion of like, we must follow the score. Like, I don't think he wanted that. So he probably wanted it to have a new life over time. I'm sure that he wanted people to engage creatively with his work. So, in the same way that I would want people to engage creatively with my work. So I think that this notion of like, we always critique this idea of like the composer genius, or like this model that it's like this austere thing that has to be preserved and like some vacuum sealed container, is something that I think we could challenge over time, and think about how can we change our performance practice and our engagement with this music to something that is more sustainable and allows for new audiences, for new voices, to new opinions to kind of also have a moment to think about how do they want to engage with that work.
Thank you for listening to For Good Measure, and a special thank you to our guest, Nina Shekhar, for joining us today. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to our podcast by clicking on the subscribe button, and support us by sharing it with your friends, posting about it on social media, and leaving us a rating and a review. To learn more about E4TT, our concert season online and in the Bay Area, or to make a tax-deductible donation, please visit us at e4tt.org. This podcast is made possible in part by a grant from the California Arts Council and generous donors like you. For Good Measure is produced by Nanette McGuinness and Ensemble for These Times, and designed by Brennan Stokes, with special thanks to co-producer and audio engineer Stephanie M. Neumann. Remember to keep supporting equity in the arts, and tune in next week for Good Measure.